Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Exploring National Insights webinar. My name is Monica Lewis. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the engagement manager at SMU DataArts. I'll be your host for today's presentation. I want to take a quick moment to describe my physical description. I am an African American woman in my late 30s. I'm wearing a brown blouse and a black jacket, and my hair is pulled back. I have clear rimmed glasses and a white wall as my background. I would like to also acknowledge that I'm on the ancestral lands of the Kushata, Tonkawa, and Sana indigenous communities, now known as Houston, Texas. On behalf of our team at SMU Data Arts, we sincerely thank each of you for joining today's session, where we will explore our national insights and have a conversation on the operating and financial health trends that are facing the arts and cultural organizational sector. Before I introduce all of our amazing panelists and presenters, I would like to provide a bit of housekeeping that'll help it direct you on how to engage with us during our presentation today. Before I start, I will say we are expecting a very large crowd of folks. And with that, I want to just encourage you to know that we may not get to every comment or every question today, but we do hope that you stay really engaged with us during our time together. First, we want to acknowledge that we are recording today's presentation, and we'll be sure to share a copy of this recording along with the slides that we've referenced today. I'll also point out a few helpful Zoom features. Again, to engage with us, you have to your access the Q&A feature and the chat feature, and that'll be on your Zoom dashboard. You're welcome to share any questions at any point in time during our presentation. And you're also able to use the chat feature to follow any links that we share directly with you, or to communicate any of your responses or even questions that you have about today's content. And again, just to reiterate to the new folks who have joined in our webinar space, we may not get to every question, and that's okay. Our team will help direct you with some ways to continue to reach out and engage with us after our time together. I just want to note that as you share your responses and your general comments in the chat feature specifically, I want to ensure that you're either communicating with everyone, and that would be all attendees who are a part of today's webinar, or directly to your host and panelists. And that'll be private and not shared to everyone. And we do ask that you exercise some community norms, and that's just to keep everything respectful and moving forward. So we encourage everyone to be kind. We're all coming into this space in different walks of life, and the chat is meant to create conversation. And also note that your chat is visible if you do select to share with everyone. And my final note is that closed captioning is available, and you'll find that by clicking the CC icon on your dashboard. Now, with that, I want to take a quick moment to explore our agenda for today. During our time, we will explore the revenue, expenses, and bottom line in our national trends data. We'll even explore data that takes a bit of a deeper look outside of the averages for a clearer understanding of what's happening in the sector. We'll then transition to our panel conversation, where we'll hear from experts within the field, and you'll be able to share and hear their reactions and responses to the data. And with that, I'd like to quickly introduce our amazing panel. I'm excited to welcome and introduce Jericha Senyak. Jericha is a financial consultant specializing in nonprofit finance, fiscal sponsorship, and the financial empowerment for art and cultural workers. Although she's rooted in Northern California, she provides consulting, coaching, and workshops to nonprofit workers nationwide, and has worked with a dozen of well-known art and cultural organizations. Jericha, we're so excited to have you. Would you like to say hello to our audience?
Thank you so much, Monica. It's wonderful to be here. Just a little description of myself physically. I'm an olive-skinned woman with long dark hair pulled back in front of my shoulder. I am wearing something with black straps with a blurred green and white background, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jericha. We're excited to learn from you. We'll also hear from Jeremy Johnson. Jeremy is an outspoken advocate for cities, public-private partnerships, and the power of the arts and cultural sector to bolster democracy in American communities. As the president and CEO of both Assembly for the Arts and Assembly for Action, Jeremy has championed efforts to grow Northeast Ohio's creative economy and expand equitable public investment in the creative sector. Jeremy, we are so excited to learn from you. Would you like to say hello?
Thank you, Monica. It's great to be here. Jeremy Johnson. I'm an African American male with salt and pepper hair, very short, wearing a dark jacket and a white shirt. I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And last but not least, we are also excited to hear and learn from Rebecca Thomas. Rebecca is the founder and principal of the Rebecca Thomas and Associates organization. RTA helps nonprofits and their supporters balance their societal aspirations with business realities. She assists nonprofit leaders in making choices that build organizational health and adaptability. She also collaborates with philanthropy, to design and implement grant strategies and programs that better align resources to organizational needs. Rebecca, we're so excited to hear from you. Would you also like to say hello and greet our audience?
Thanks, Monica, and hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a white woman. I have shoulder-length dark brown hair. I'm wearing a blue and white striped shirt, and I have a lovely piano in the background. And I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you so much for each of you for providing your physical description and saying hello. I am also excited to introduce our presenter and panelist is Dr. Jen Benoit-Bryan. She is the Executive Director of SMU DataArts and a Professor of Arts Management at Southern Methodist University. Her research focuses on the conditions that support vibrant art ecosystems, the sustainability and well-being of the cultural workforce, and the broader community that impacts equitable access to the arts. Jen is a recognized leader in arts research methodologies, and she frequently contributes her expertise in a number of advisor capacities and as a grant reviewer. Jen, I'm excited to hand things off to you as you welcome our audience to our presentation.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'll give a brief physical description before I get started. I'm a white woman in my 40s with curly brown hair, boxy glasses, and a plum sweater. My pronouns are she, her, and I am so excited to be here today with all of you. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us as we go through these really fascinating insights about the arts and culture sector. Looking forward to diving into these trends with all of you and excited to see what questions you have for us. Great. Okay. Sorry, Monica gave me control. But it is not working. Okay. Thank you. Are you able to shift things for me? Thank you. Apologies. We did try, we did test it out and it worked earlier, but so before I start to share the data, I want to take a moment to talk about the organizations whose data are reflected in this analysis. We use data for all organizations who completed a cultural data profile through the CDP for any fiscal year between 2019 and 2024, which is more than 6,500 arts organizations nationwide. And here you can see a breakdown of these organizations by budget size. This is similar to how this breaks down across the sector. We see the biggest group represented in small organizations, which we think of as budgets below $250,000. Then we have medium-sized organizations with budgets at that level up to $1 million, and large with budgets over $1 million. To all of you on this call who provided data through the cultural data profile over this period, I just want to extend my thanks for making this analysis and discussion possible. We truly could not do this without your participation. Also, these national trends will be available on our website. The team's going to put the link in the chat, and you can dive even deeper into these trends and see more information about the sample of organizations who were reflected in the methodology there if you're interested in that. So moving to the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about revenue, and we're going to start by looking at overall revenue. And here, what we see when we look across these years is a steep decline, particularly in fiscal year 2024. In fact, it's the steepest decline within the 6-year period that we're examining here. And this chart shows averages across 3 types of revenue: contributed, earned, and investment revenue. And there's some differences in those patterns. You can see that earned revenue, the blue portion of the bars on the bottom, had a slight decline in 2024, and average contributed revenue, that pink portion of the bar in the middle, had a much steeper decline of 25% over the last year. This graph and all of the ones that I will be showing today show dollars that have not been adjusted for inflation, what we call nominal dollars. So the decline in revenue from 2019 that you see here would be even greater when we think about the sort of lower purchasing power that a dollar has in 2024 relative to what it had back in 2019. So next, we'll look into the different kinds of contributed revenue that make up that middle chunk of the chart that we just looked at. And we can see when we look across sources of contributed revenue that every source of contributed revenue was in decline between 2023 and 2024 for arts organizations. That's a really challenging storm of factors for arts leaders to be navigating. And it'd be great to hear from those of you who are on the webinar today what that's feeling like, if your experiences are similar here. In fact, we see that every source has fallen actually below pre-pandemic levels from 2019, even before we sort of account for or adjust for inflation. And foundation funding, the light blue line here at the top, was the largest source of funding and also had the largest decline over the last year when we look at average levels across organizations. So next, we'll shift over and look at the other big side of the balance sheet, changes in expenses and how they affected organizational capacity. And perhaps unsurprisingly, organizations are making real adjustments in light of those shifts in revenue. We see that organizations reduced spending in 2024 in response to those revenue pressures by an average of 23% over the past year. That included dips both in personnel expenses, the blue bottom portion of this chart, and non-personnel expenses, the pink portion of the bar on the top. And so organizations are not concentrating their cuts just in kind of personnel or non-personnel. It's really distributed relatively equally across those 2 categories of expenses. While grappling with big cuts to personnel spending, organizations also made smaller cuts in payments to artists. So you can see here that artist payments, that dark blue portion of the bar on the bottom, declined as well over the last year, but at 11%, whereas when we look at personnel spending that's going to employees of the organizations, that decline was 23%. So it's clear that arts organizations are making some, challenging trade-offs in their decisions about where to cut resources. And to the extent possible, it seems like they're trying to insulate artists to some degree from those cuts. We do have some bright spots in the data, though, and one is that organizations are serving a growing number of paid and free attendees on average, even while they're cutting staff. So that represents its own set of challenges for organizations to navigate. But digging into this data a little bit, you can see that paid attendees, which is the blue portion of the bars on the bottom of the chart, increased by 13% over the last year, 2023 to 2024. And free attendees, the pink portion of the bar, increased almost twice as rapidly by 22% over that same period. So arts and culture organizations are reaching more people, and they're reaching more people in a way that is low barrier and through free attendance and programming activities. We'll shift next to look at bottom lines, thinking about surpluses and deficits. And here we see some sobering statistics that line up with what we've looked at in the revenue and expense side of things, that the proportion of organizations that are running a deficit in 2024 increased to 44%, the highest point in the previous 6 years, that those margins across the sector have been tightening since 2021, which was, the height of pandemic funding payments coming in. So fewer organizations running deficits. And the kind of revenue declines that we've seen over the last year have really exacerbated that trend recently. Another way of thinking about sort of cash flow or cushion for arts and cultural organizations is working capital. And in this slide, we take a look at how many months an organization could continue to operate without additional sort of influx of resources. And that median working capital has continued a multi-year decline, again, since that peak in 2021, falling to the equivalent of 4 months of expenses in 2024. It's a really critical kind of metric to be tracking for arts and culture organizations because it's really tied to their ability to navigate uncertainty, change, challenge, both in the short term and the long term. But despite that trend of decline, we see that working capital still remains higher than it was in 2019. So that's kind of illustrating the ongoing effects of increased levels of contributed revenue from the pandemic relief programs. Organizations are spending those down, but they still are retaining more of that than they had heading into the pandemic. One kind of point of comparison here, the Nonprofit Finance Fund recently shared that just over half of all nonprofits have less than 3 months of working capital at this point. So arts organizations may actually be faring just a little better than nonprofit organizations overall at this point in time. So we want to look beyond the averages in a few ways. We've been looking at averages and medians across all organizations, but the next set of slides looks a little deeper at how trends vary both by type of statistic and by size of the organization. I will note that this analysis isn't actually yet published on our website, but it is slated for an article soon to be published. So consider this a sneak peek into these insights. On this slide, we can see that kind of despite that decline in average total revenues that we talked about from 2023 to 2024, that most organizations, if we think about the organization level rather than the dollar level, actually experienced an increase in revenue in this same period. So that indicates that revenue losses were likely concentrated among a subset of organizations and not a universal experience for all arts and culture organizations. And I think Rebecca may speak to this a little bit later in more detail. This was true for both earned and contributed revenue as well. And I think it's an important contextual note as we think about sort of what lens we're using here. Is it the dollar amounts or is it the experience of the typical organization? So shifting to a comparison based on size, when we look at revenue trends across size categories, we can see that large organizations had the largest average revenue losses. Large organizations are represented on the graph all the way to the right on this slide. And you can see that they had an average revenue decline of 22% from 2023 to 2024. And of course, for large budget organizations, the dollar amounts that we're talking about are larger. And so they tend to influence things for the averages overall. Small organizations, that's the graph all the way on the left, had a much smaller decline, 1% in revenue from 2023 to 2024 on average. This kind of stagnant average revenue number was a change from the previous 3 years when small organizations had seen pretty consistent growth. And then medium organizations in the middle here had a slight 2% increase in their average revenues in 2024. This also represented a slowdown in the consistent revenue growth for those organizations after a period of growth. And so both small and medium organizations were on this trajectory heading up, which has either kind of slowed or reversed course. Large organizations have been navigating much more tumultuous kind of path here over the last few years. So if we shift to expenses, those are the pink lines on this chart. You can get a sense of the way that expenses and revenues interact and kind of add up to financial sustainability. So organizations of all size increased spending as revenue grew over the last few years. This may have been due to some new costs, but was also largely driven by inflation as organizations had to keep up with rising prices. Across all size categories, you can see that the revenue and expense lines begin to get closer over the last few years, and that's reflecting that smaller cushion that organizations have in terms of kind of having a surplus that they can carry forward and rely on. And that was really exacerbated in 2024 for small and large organizations who had revenue declines in those groups, but still affecting medium-sized organizations as well. Great. So thinking beyond total revenue and expenses, my colleague Katie put this great kind of chart together that gives a bullet point list of kind of what's happening in the orbit of each of these size organizations. So I want to share just a few other highlights. For small organizations, we saw a slight decline in both earned and contributed revenue. In terms of staffing, we saw that they maintained their personnel spending after a significant period of growth. So it has kind of flattened, but has not shifted to a decline. Bright spots in terms of revenue generation for small organizations were increases in both foundation and individual support. That indicates to me that some organizations may be successfully replacing the pandemic relief funding with funding from private sources. We shift over to the medium organizations. We saw a slight decline in contributed revenue in 2024, but a 13% increase in earned revenues. In terms of staffing, they also maintained their personnel spending while slightly reducing their spending overall. A few bright spots for medium-sized organizations, again, that's $250,000 to $1 million, are a 40% increase in ticket sales, as well as a 21% increase in paid attendance specifically. Shifting over now to the large organization bucket, those with budgets above $1 million, we saw a decline in both earned and contributed revenue for these organizations, and every category of contributed revenue declined except for trustee giving, which was flat. These organizations reported a 21% cut in personnel expenditures, bringing their spending and staffing levels to a 6-year low. One bright spot, though, for large organizations was that they are experiencing increased ticket sales of 14%, though this is offset by declines in other sources of earned revenue, such as tuition and workshops. So as I mentioned at the top, all of this will be explored in more detail in a forthcoming article on our site, so I hope you'll stay tuned for that. Now, I know I've hit you with a lot of statistics, so I'm really delighted to pass it back over to Monica to welcome our panelists and to help us really dig into these and understand how these trends are playing out for organizations in different contexts across the field.
Thank you so much, Jen. With that, I'm going to transition as we bring in our panelists to share their responses and reactions to the data. I will stop sharing, and you'll spotlight, we'll see our esteemed colleagues and panelists as they join this conversation. I want to quickly remind everyone that you're able to engage with us during this conversation. Feel free to utilize that chat and Q&A. My team of folks are keeping tally of great questions for our panelists as they get started. So I just want to bring our panelists in with the first prompt of questions. And I just want to ask each of you about these findings. Rebecca, starting with you, how do these findings resonate with you in your work? What are you seeing with the organizations that you're working with?
Great, thanks. So I would say that these trends are largely consistent with what we're seeing in our consulting practice. We do work mostly with organizations with budget sizes of above $1 million, and our arts partners have been experiencing for a few years now stagnating or declining contributed revenue alongside persistently high costs that initially reflected inflationary pressures, but that still largely reflect hiring decisions that were made after the pandemic period. I will tell you that in our portfolios, regardless of size, this year is not shaping up to be a lot better than last. The freezing and the clawbacks of funding from government agencies do seem to be disproportionately affecting small and medium-sized nonprofits in the arts and beyond. But as the data shows, larger organizations are bearing the brunt of the pullback across revenue sources, which is why they're cutting their costs so substantially. I do think it's important to remember that some of the declines that we are seeing do represent a natural pullback from the extraordinary levels of giving that both public and private institutions poured into the sector during the pandemic. That emergency funding was structured to be unrestricted. It was structured to be multi-year in nature, the best kind of money, but it wasn't intended to be forever money. Understandably, organizations used it, right, to hire new artists and administrators, to adjust salaries, to market rate, to provide benefits. And I am sure we would all agree that those human capital investments were very long overdue. But now we're in this place where that funding is gone. And so as some donors and foundations pull back or change their priorities to meet this moment, we're seeing many arts groups left with cost structures that they can't afford anymore. And so that's why we're seeing the deficits of the scale that you just showed in the data, Jen.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Jericha, I want to bring you into this conversation. What are you seeing with the organizations that you're working with?
I think similarly to Rebecca, this data for me is not at all surprising to see because this, I think, tracks out the kind of anecdotal evidence from my client base. So I work primarily with small organizations or small to mid-size. So almost all of my clients have budgets under $2 million, and a lot of them are smaller. I also work with a lot of fiscal sponsors and fiscally sponsored projects. And so being able to see those patterns, you're getting a lot of looks at really small arts nonprofits and arts kind of based organizations. And I think that what we see in the data, especially for those smaller organizations, is how tight the margins always are. Right. And I think that a lot of those smaller organizations are also the ones that got the least amount of really significant funding, right? They didn't have the resources to apply for SBA grants, right? Like they don't have loans on their books, right? Maybe they got a PPP loan, but they're much more used to operating dollar for dollar for dollar every year. And so I think that trend of seeing those kind of razor thin lines is not at all surprising and really points to the resilience of small organizations that kind of turn on a dime.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jericha. Jeremy, I want to bring you in as you work with organizations in a bit of a different capacity. Can you talk about what you're seeing in Cleveland?
Thank you. As the Arts Council for the region, we're working with really the gamut of organizations, from those very small ones that Jericha mentioned, but we are also in advocacy for all the groups, including our large anchor institutions. As we talk to nonprofits, especially the smaller ones, they've been on the edge for some time, and especially even since the study has happened, even more so because of those federal clawbacks. One of our local theater companies that's very progressive, I recall them saying that 3 years ago, their corporate supporters were there for them. A year ago, they said, we will support you, but we want to be anonymous. And then this year, those groups aren't even returning their calls. So it's been a trend that's been tough. But I think, to Jericha's point again, there is nimbleness with the smaller groups that we've seen. They're finding ways. They've been on lean budgets, lean staffs, and they're finding ways to survive. And also, fiscal sponsorships is really important. We do fiscal sponsorships, and we've seen a slight uptick in folks wanting that. So, yeah. And I'll talk more about some of the other points as we get later in the conversation.
Thank you so much.
This is a little off script, but all of you brought up this theme of flexibility and nimbleness and how that tends to be easier for smaller organizations to do. I wonder if you have any reflections on kind of ownership of space and how that might be part of this set of circumstances that different sized organizations are experiencing differently at this point.
Absolutely.
I'll jump in.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
I can think of at least one medium-sized organization, a wonderful film festival organization. This summer, they totally downsized their space, and they are going totally remote now so that they could be more nimble and watching those numbers more effectively. So there are other groups in our community. They're literally moving in with us. You know how families have people move in and couch surfing? They're not couch surfing, but they are cubicle surfing with us very intentionally. So they don't have the load of paying rent. And we are in the Midtown Collaboration Center, which was intentionally built for nonprofits to come together and work together. So we're seeing more of that.
Say that almost all of my clients who had spaces gave up their spaces during the pandemic, and it was a huge relief to them, truly a huge relief, because rent has been such, in the Bay Area where I'm based, right? Rents are so high and continue to get higher. And so giving up that budget line was enormous for a lot of my clients. Kind of to Jeremy's point, I think there's also been a huge uptick in kind of resource sharing, spatially, but in lots of other kind of shared services, which I know is something that Rebecca has seen as well, is the kind of like request for more shared services, more back-end support. I think that's also why I'm seeing a huge uptick in fiscal sponsorship for the same reason. This sense of administrative costs actually being something that nonprofits can now shave in a way that could not be shaved prior to the pandemic, when everyone was like, well, you have to have an office. Like, well, you don't actually, right? Kind of the opposite of the tech sector and the kind of demand for everyone to return to the office. Nonprofits are like, oh my gosh, what do you mean? We can work from anywhere. It's amazing. But I think there's also another piece that is really, really important about the nimbleness of small organizations, and that is the tightness of the staff and the degree to which almost no one is touching the budget. If you're a $5 million organization, there are so many people involved in the process of budgeting. Budgets are slower to turn around. Every cut has to be run by many different people, right? And so the ability to reframe, remanage, rethink your budget at a $5 million organization is radically different than the pivot that is possible if your budget is $500,000.
I would have to definitely echo that. I would echo, we're hearing from other funders who work with smaller nonprofits, there is a major need for support for governance, budgeting, just that capacity to manage those issues is huge for Northeast Ohio, for many of those groups that are in those smaller budget size.
Rebecca, any
I was simply going
to
reaffirm what's already been said, but I think data and experience absolutely show that as organizations grow, as they acquire and expand their spaces and hire more full-time fixed cost personnel, right, their margins tighten, their liquidity begins to decline, right? Fixed assets do not, by and large, make arts organizations financially secure, even though, of course, sufficient space is essential for art making and art presentation. But we, like the others here on this call, are seeing arts organizations put capital projects on ice. We have a museum right now that's divesting of one of its aging facilities, and other organizations in our portfolio that are exploring different ways to share their space with smaller organizations that are mission aligned.
A helpful range of perspectives on this. Thanks, everybody. One thing that we always grapple with is the lag in available data. And so I just want to acknowledge that this analysis ends in 2024, and that my sense is that funding realities have become even more fraught in the last few months, given some of the news of 2025. So I'd love just to talk a little bit about how organizations have been navigating this period that we don't yet have quantitative data to kind of reflect. And I'd love to start with you, Jericha. Have you seen organizations employing new strategies, ramping up existing strategies? What does this kind of last 6 months, or gosh, we're in September, last 9 months of 2025 look like?
I won't sugarcoat it. It's been hard. It's been hard. My clients are in pain. They're really struggling. They have lost so much funding. I mean, I get emotional thinking about how anguished a lot of my clients are feeling, not just about what has happened in the last 9 months, but also about what the funding landscape in the future looks like. Loss of grants. When you're a $200,000 organization and you lose a $40,000 NEA grant, that's a staff person you've just lost. Right. And that's so much capacity that you've just lost. Even things like retroactive adjustments to awarded CAC grants, that's California Arts Council, for those of you not in California, which were made this year, right? Again, when you're operating on these razor margins and you lose a grant that you've gotten every year, or a grant that you were awarded and have planned on and budgeted for is clawed back, that's devastating to you, right? And I think that it speaks tremendously to the creative ingenuity and the incredible thought power of these organizations that they are making it work, that they are figuring it out, right? I'm seeing some really amazing adjustments. I wish I didn't have to see them, but I am seeing them. And again, I do think that there is a way in which it is easier for small organizations to make that pivot, to say, okay, we're just not going to run this program. I do see, and I think the data also bears this out prior to 2025, I do see a huge, huge spotlight on paying people, right? The commitment to artists, the understanding that if we're not paying the people who make this work, then we don't get to have it, right? And I think that a lot of the clients I'm seeing who are hardest hit are the ones who do have fixed costs or, space rental costs that they can't get past. So theater and dance organizations in kind of my client base are the ones that are having the hardest time, because those are the ones that have the highest space rental costs that haven't gone away. They still need performance space, and those spaces have only gotten more expensive, and their ticket sales can't go up because people are hurting individually and financially. And so that's the other thing that we're seeing, right, is I think we're going to not necessarily see that trend upwards in ticket sales continuing, because individual people across the country are financially hurting in a different way. And so every individual source of funding is also going down. I wish that foundations were willing to be a little bit more courageous and responsive in the patterns that we're seeing. I think that's my biggest hope right now, is that people will really see how much everyone is hurting and reward that flexibility.
It's such a helpful perspective. And I'm curious, Rebecca, among the pool of organizations that you're working directly with, how does this resonate with what you're seeing? Is there any advice that you're sharing with your clients right now in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working with arts organizations for over 20 years now, and I've never seen this kind of wholesale reconsideration of the structure and the business model of what makes an arts and culture organization. So many of our clients are fundamentally rethinking how they work, what they do, their relationships, as we said, to spaces, but also to their community partners. And that is largely because nipping and tucking around the edges just hasn't been sufficient to resolve the scale of the structural gaps. And there's also a lot of fear and uncertainty, right? What's the next shoe that's going to drop? How do we plan for the unexpected? Their organizations are planning, right? In my portfolio, we have 3 theaters exploring a merger. We have 2 museums exploring a complete consolidation of all of the administrative and managerial positions that they currently keep separately. But the idea is to consolidate administration and leave each organization with an independent brand and space and programming. So people are getting creative, exploring shared staffing models, as we said, outsourcing arrangements. I can't really tell you if all of these changes are going to be successful, but I do think that cultural groups need to embrace change in a way that perhaps we haven't thought about it in the past. In terms of what we're offering cultural leaders in terms of advice, I would say it's really important to stay laser focused on the activities that are core to your mission, that are really critical to your community, that they have a willingness and an ability to pay for, and activities that are aligned with your existing staff's capabilities. Right now is sort of not the time to take on too much that is new and uncertain, right? Or to acquire fixed assets that are going to leave you burdened, like some of these large organizations are right now. As you can, right, seek unrestricted support to pay for what you already do. And if a longtime funder or an important board member who's been with you for a long time asks you how can they make the biggest difference, consider asking them for what we call change capital. It's multi-year money that helps organizations do these transitions because it takes time and it costs money, even to go through a process that involves letting things go. We haven't talked today at all about the balance sheet, but I spend a lot of time reading and planning balance sheets, and it is really important that every organization understand its vulnerabilities on the balance sheet. Cash in the bank is your first line of defense, right? And if you have none, the urgency to change is much greater than if you have 4 or 5, 6+ months of liquidity remaining. So savings really are the risk management strategy. And every organization should be thinking about not just how much you have, but establishing budgets and managing to results that ensure that you either maintain several months of liquidity or accumulate over time that liquidity, because that's what allows you as an institution to take risk, to manage risk, and to take care of your fixed assets if you already have them.
So helpful. Thanks, Rebecca. Jeremy, how does this resonate with what you're seeing, what you're hearing in Cleveland? Oh, Jeremy, you're on mute.
It's complicated, Jen. I'm hearing Rebecca say, organizations, be careful of those capital assets, and stick to your knitting. At the same time, all of our nonprofits, especially the small medium, where they're told collaborate, 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 work together. R&D, ideation, just to work together with others takes money, but you're supposed to stick to your knitting. And Jericha's nodding. So there's this tension between we need to save costs, we need to figure out something new and be creative, but that's challenging. So we're seeing all of that here in Cleveland. Folks are getting support to collaborate. And then, again, I mentioned I'm here in the Cleveland Foundation funded Midtown Collaboration Center, where nonprofits are doubling up here. But just the R&D, I like to call it the research and development of finding that new solution often goes unfunded while you're trying to stick to your knitting, your mission central. A big thing that's happening here in Cleveland, because of all the changes, we've been able to lock in some government support in the midst of all of this. Cuyahoga County, where Cleveland is based, has a 20-year-old tax that solely for nonprofits. That tax was about to end, and we got it to the voters with advocacy, and it was renewed. That tax, which goes through a government agency, Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, that's another CAC, our tax is now locked in for the next 10 years. So those groups that are going through everything that we've heard from Rebecca and Jericha, they know that at least will be stable for them for the time being, that they can turn to that government funding. So I guess one of my things is do not underestimate the power of advocacy, whether that's locally and certainly here in Ohio, to leverage really the arms of government support statewide and regionally is really important, because as we know, Washington is very tough right now, and people they've been affected by the clawbacks, but we're locking it down certainly here in the Buckeye State, especially here in Northeast Ohio, thankfully. But that's not sufficient. I don't want to give that impression. We're already looking at what will succeed this special tax.
Yeah, it occurs to me, Jeremy, that and kind of the framing you shared around that change capital is so critical, and that you could think about the same thing from an advocacy perspective, right? Investing in advocacy to set up longer term, reliable sources of capital at a local, regional level is also a big investment, and one that requires bought in funders. And I know you have some really fantastic advocates who are pulling with you, Jeremy, and the fact that Assembly for the Arts is available to Cleveland as a resource is hugely impactful. So it makes me think about what city resources are available, what art service organizations are available regionally, and how we can continue to support them in that effective advocacy.
I would just add, as a coda, we're thankful that the foundation community, philanthropy, has been a part of the advocacy. They invested in the levy to make sure the voters pass that big time. And they're investing in Assembly for the Arts to help the entire sector. So, but at the same time, we're looking at what other cities and other states and regions are doing, as you know, Jen. So it's not over. It's not over.
I think there's also something I just want to touch on here that feels like a little bit of an elephant in the room, which is, I'm a financial consultant, and when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I'm very conscious, as we're talking about R&D and liquidity and all of these things, that to do that advocacy, to do that deep dive into your balance sheet, you have to understand your financials. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge out loud to everybody here that the vast majority of nonprofits in this country are incredibly under-resourced when it comes to understanding their own financials. And a huge part of that is that we don't have dedicated nonprofit financial tools, right? Like the standard accounting software that the vast majority of nonprofits use is not designed for nonprofits, and it gets worse every month, right? And the number of clients that I have who feel shame, anxiety, misery, and personal responsibility for their lack of insight into their own financials when it is absolutely a systemic issue and not their individual fault. I think that if we don't acknowledge that, and we talk about things like, how do we pivot on budgets? We say, does this organization even have a budget that actually makes sense for its own needs? Who on their finance committee actually has the training and background to be able to make good decisions or ask these questions? Where do they get that training? How many of us have seen a wonderful resource board full of ways to learn about finance? Because I haven't. And if you have, I would love to know where you found it, because I have looked, right? And so I think as we're talking about these numbers, one of the things we really need to talk about in terms of advocacy is advocating to funders to support the actual financial education of nonprofits and not simply assume that because we started a nonprofit, suddenly we know what a balance sheet is. We don't. Right? Most people do not know how to read their balance sheet. That is my work. And so how do we support each other? How do we laterally get together, collaborate, as Jeremy is talking about, to ask the questions that Rebecca is so thoughtfully encouraging all these organizations to ask? Do you know where your working capital lives? Do you know what that number is? How do you get it? Where do you learn? I think these are really, really important questions for us to be asking as we're looking at these numbers if we want to be mindfully facing what's ahead of us.
I agree with that 100%. And I will add that because we've talked a little bit today about how organizations are exploring cost sharing opportunities as a way of cutting back on their administrative costs, that we also just need to be a little careful that we don't take overhead out of the system or reduce it to its barest minimum as organizations seek to control costs, because without marketing skills and fundraising skills, organizations can't raise money, and without adequate basic accounting and bookkeeping and the right systems and software, right, organizations also can't properly see where they are and know where they're headed. So it's really important that we not go straight to getting rid of, right, all of those capacities or cutting them back too leanly as we look to creative ways to change.
You could say that louder for the people in the back, Rebecca. The marketing and fundraising capacity is so essential, and as our nonprofit board members and funders are looking at always project support, we need to get back to again that capacity support constantly without having that oxygen mask on for our own organizations. How are we going to service the rest of the field and artists, et cetera?
Now, this is so great. I am taking a peek at some of the responses and the emojis that are coming through from this conversation. It feels very poignant and reflective of the folks that are in the room. Before I switch to the Q&A that is coming in from our amazing audience, I just wanted to switch back to you, Rebecca, for a moment to maybe talk about advocacy from the funder perspective. What do we want funders to know when it's about supporting organizations right now?
Yeah, I always feel like I'm on my soapbox when I say this, but I think that multi-year unrestricted general operating support is the money that gives cultural organizations the flexibility to direct the money where they need it most. And at a time of great uncertainty, when so much is in flux, that's where the need is. And as we talk about new ways of working, new ways of programming, new ways of staffing, right? We also have to remember that collaboration and change require additional funding over and above annual operating support. And so organizations also need support for the transition costs that are associated with figuring out which changes might work and which ones don't, because there's going to be a lot of trial and error as institutions figure out what it means to collaborate, cohabitate, right, and thrive in an environment like the current one.
Can I jump in and ask Rebecca? I feel like funders know this. This research has been happening for years, but has there been a turn? We've seen some funders have been outliers in doing this, but have you seen that?
We're seeing the same stagnation. So Grantmakers in the Arts actually recently did a survey of its members who I think are hearing this message all of the time, because I'm out there doing it with Grantmakers in the Arts with some regularity. And when the survey was recently sent out, it did suggest that private foundations are slowing their general operating support, are slowing their multi-year funding. It's not that it's going away necessarily, but the pace is very much not headed in the right direction. after a real shift that we saw in, 2021, 2022 to the positive, people are starting to kind of resort or return to some of their historical patterns.
I will say that I have seen a couple really heartening trends. In the Bay Area, there's a group of private funders who got together what they're calling a common application, which is a resource that they are trying to share really widely, and they're doing advocacy to other funders around it. What they did was basically get together an application format that they've all agreed to use so that when you're applying to one funder, you have the same questions, the same kind of preparation to all the funders. And the hugest thing that they did, which I would really like to see funders do across the sector, is they have dropped proprietary budget and financial reporting formats, and they are allowing organizations to submit their financials in their own internal formats. They've realized how much work it is actually costing organizations to constantly translate every time they make a grant application into a new format, right? And so they said, just send us ours. We, as the funders, will take on the work of interpreting your financials. After all, we have the resources, we have the expertise, we'll make sense of it. And what they said is actually it did not make really any noticeable difference in the amount of work that it took them. And I would guess that they're actually getting more information about each organization's real financials because they're getting the story from within the organization. So that's something that I really wish funders would understand, is how much it costs organizations to do this application process. And even little things like that, which don't necessarily change the breakdown of who gets funding, it just changes what it takes for an organization to even put the application in. It's these little things, right? But there's also a tendency to kind of think that multi-year funding should only go to established organizations that can prove, right, that they're able to use it. And there is a kind of unconscious means testing that I think a lot of funders do that I would also like to see go down, right? Where it's like, oh, if your financials are messy, that must mean that you're not trustworthy to have funding, as opposed to, oh, your financials are messy, that means you need investment in your systems. And I would love to see more partnership and investment in elevating organizations that are coming up from nothing and doing this amazing work and having some trust in them to be doing the work that they're doing, right? So I think that's another mindset shift that I would love to see advocacy doing.
Yep. And you really can't ask a small or mid-sized organization to do 3-year strategic planning and 3-year financial planning if they don't have insights into the funding that they're going to be able to count on. Otherwise, you're going to have strategic plans that sit on the shelf because they're not grounded in realistic revenue realities, which is unfortunately what we've seen for far too long.
Now, these are really valid and great points. And in the questions that my team have shared with me, you've answered them really indirectly. And I want to highlight a question that has just come into the chat about centering BIPOC organizations and protecting wins and strengthening the work of cultural organizations and institutions. What are you seeing? And does that question kind of resonate? How folks who are within BIPOC organizations can protect their wins and kind of navigate times right now and find allies maybe in these moments?
I'll take a stab at that for starters. It's still tough for the BIPOC organizations, those that are led or that are serving. And there have been a number of our foundations created, certainly coming out of the last 5 years, programs that center support for BIPOC. I don't have to tell this group that in the current climate, you have to keep fighting through to maintain that, because folks may come after you. So I think we're going to have to be creative. Many groups are finding that they're going to do the same work. They're going to do the work that supports BIPOC, but the language may change, but the action continues. So this is a very tricky time, and that question is very relevant.
Absolutely.
I would say that probably the majority of my client base is BIPOC-led, right? Because small organizations are, right? You see, I mean, this is a fact of the arts landscape, is that we see a lot of really amazing BIPOC organizations represented in the smaller sections, because folks are coming from marginalized backgrounds, which means that they don't have access to the same kind of capital just out of the ground, right? So they can't fundraise off the backs of their constituents because their constituents are the folks that they're trying to serve, right? And so in terms of that protection, I really echo what Jeremy is saying about a flexibility around the language we're using in order to survive, right? Like, how do we think about what is necessary to navigate the very uncomfortable and painful realities that we are in? What does it mean to sacrifice our integrity of work versus being creative in the language that we're using in order to continue making the asks, right? Like, a lot of my clients panicked this year when the new guidelines for the NEA came out and people were like, what are we supposed to be focusing on? And at first there was a kind of surge in folks being like, well, I'm going to protest. Like, I'm not even going to apply. And I was like, no, please apply. Because if you don't apply, they're going to be like, see, we don't even need funding for the arts. Just be creative. If they're going to be like, focus on the bicentennial of the Constitution or whatever it is, talk about your work in the context of the bicentennial of the Constitution. Get that money. Like, don't be afraid to go get that money, right? And so I think for me, that's a really big piece of it, is keeping ourselves from being cowed by the pressure and being creative in our ways of saying, okay, you're going to say what I can and can't do. I'm so creative, you'll never see me coming. Right? That's what I'm seeing folks doing. And I wish we didn't have to. Right? Like, the fact that I'm even having to advocate for this makes me so sad. But tell your truth, tell your story in the context that works in this reality. And hopefully we'll get through it and you don't have to do that in the future.
That feels so important. And I just want you to know the comments and the emojis. Jericha, I think you're tapping into the feeling in the hearts of the folks in our audience. Jen, did you have any last minute questions for our panelists before we switch to our last 5 minutes of our time?
Oh gosh, so many, of course. Lots of questions. I think, one thing that I'm sitting with a little bit and looking through some of the comments and questions that have come through is how there can be a dark side to nimbleness, right? There are things that are lost when you shift from full-time staff to part-time or contractors. There are things that are lost when you have less space resources available. And so just knowing that this is a balance that organizations are having to navigate and think about what is the kind of gain that they might receive walking down some of these paths that we've talked about versus the costs that are included. I just love any reflections that you have on how you've seen organizations navigate those things or try to minimize some of the cost side of that equation as part of these shifts.
It's a great question. I mean, I think it is a balancing act. I think every organization does come at it a little bit differently. I think on the one hand, we see even BIPOC, when I look at many of our BIPOC clients, they look financially the most secure. They have the most liquidity. They're more likely to be profitable. But then when you say, well, why is that so? Well, one of the reasons it's so is that many BIPOC-led organizations are fiscally conservative, good managers. But the other reason it's so is that they can't afford, many of them, to pay people for a full-time salary or even a part-time salary, right? There's a ton of sweat equity in that part of the sector. And so, I mean, when we work with clients, it's really about taking small measured risks, right? It's about planning for any kind of expansionary activity, sort of one small step at a time, and based on, I mean, this isn't sort of, it's pretty obvious, right? But it's budgeting for change and then making some good asks and reviewing whether you met your budget. And if you didn't, pulling back a little bit. And if you did, taking one more small risk. But I think for me, that's the biggest thing to take away is that you don't have to do it all at once, right? You can build in phases, you can build in stages, and you can do it with the resources that you have within your site.
I did see the question about nimbleness, and is nimble not so much a compliment, and how we shouldn't normalize that. I would go back to some things Jericha mentioned about fiscally sponsored projects. Sometimes maybe nonprofit structure isn't the way to go because that comes with a lot of administration, a lot of infrastructure. If you haven't gone that route of getting that 501c3, maybe you can hook up with an agency so you don't have to be as nimble with trying to get all of the infrastructure associated with 501c3 structure. And we've created this system. There is a symbiosis between nonprofits and funders. That's for a whole nother webinar. But how do we do good in the system? But maybe there's some other systems that we can still do good in the arts and culture space. So I just throw that out for the future.
Oh, that feels so great. Jericha, we have just a short amount of time, so I will challenge you to be
quick. I want to
brief.
echo what both Rebecca and Jeremy said, right? So what Rebecca said about thriftiness, right? Nimbleness is basically making a virtue of necessity. And when it comes to that thriftiness, I also see the same pattern, right? An eye on every dollar spent. And I think one thing that I would say is something that we can be seeing more of is really budgeting for and advocating for real time spent, right? If you are not paying people because they're volunteering, put that time in your budgets, right? Start asking for money for it. You might not get it, but at least funders will start seeing the realities of what it takes to actually run your operations and get it. Like, just start asking, wish out loud, ask for what you want, even knowing that you might not get it. At least we'll start seeing some more of those realities start to actually come across funders' tables. And hopefully they'll start to have a better understanding of what it actually takes for you to thrive. And going back to what Jeremy said, I feel the same way about fiscal sponsorship. I'm a huge advocate for fiscal sponsorship. I really believe in it. There's a lot more tools than there used to be. There's a new tool that I'm an advisor for, Maslow, which is basically a fiscal sponsorship banking platform, which just couldn't have existed 10 years ago, right? These tools are existing that couldn't have been possible before the kind of like Zoom age that we are in, which are making it possible for folks to do project work with way less back end. So consider, even if you have a small 501c3, maybe you can pivot even to fiscal sponsorship now, right? Like maybe we can be offering more fiscal sponsorship, because I think those are ways in which we can drop the idea that nimbleness is something that's like so awesome, like look at us go, in the same way that thriftiness really comes out of poverty, which we want to escape, and start thinking about, well, how can we get those ideas of flexibility into a space where we also have enough grounded baseline to be doing it because we choose and not because we are forced into it by the circumstances that we're in.
And with that, I feel like that's a great period to put this conversation in. I recognize that we're at the top of the hour, and I know some folks have to jump off. I do want to just echo and share my sincere thanks to each of our panelists today. Rebecca, Jericha, Jeremy. You provided great insights, and I think a lot of folks felt very seen in this conversation and within the data presented today. So thank you to each of you for sharing your time with us and your expertise. I also want to share a quick thank you to the folks in the background on our team who've been handling and navigating a lot of questions and comments. Katie, Rochelle, and Liz, thank you so much for being a great support in the background. As a reminder, we did record this conversation and our complete webinar to share this out, you will get a follow-up email that will include all of our recording and the slides from today's presentation, along with an evaluation. So if there are ways for us to improve or ways for us to continue this conversation, we'd love to hear from you. So please be sure to fill out that survey. With that, we hope that you stay connected with us at SMU DataArts as we continue to share insights from the national trends data and other reports that will come out through our platform. But without extending more time, I just want to say thank you to our panelists and to each of you for spending an hour with us to talk about this data. Thank you so much. And we sincerely hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.